The war on the Eastern Front was a much more mobile affair than that in the West. Advances and retreats were measured in tens of miles rather than hundreds of yards. The front too was very much longer, stretching from the plains of East Prussia and Galicia to the Carpathian Mountains in Austro-Hungary. Three empires were primarily involved. Germany, only united as a nation for little more than 40 years, was led by the ambitious Kaiser Wilhelm II. His southern neighbor was the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, a shadow of what it had been a few centuries earlier, and with the elderly Emperor Franz Joseph at its head. Opposing them was the vast Russian Empire. It was ruled by the Tsar, the autocratic but weak-willed Nicholas II. As in the West, though, all the initial war plans largely failed. The large but cumbersome Russian armies had intended to strike in two directions from the vast Polish salient. In the north, they would trap and destroy the Germans in East Prussia before advancing on Berlin, while simultaneously trapping the Austrian armies in Galicia. The foray into East Prussia quickly turned to disaster. The Germans destroyed one Russian army at Tannenberg at the end of August. They drove another back with heavy casualties to the river Niemen. In southern Galicia, the Austrians and Russians, both bent on attack, blundered into one another, but it was the Austrians who withdrew to the northern end of the Carpathian Mountains. The Austrians, however, had another front to the south. They had tried to crush Serbia, which was seen as the cause of the war, quickly before the Russians, as fellow Slavs, could mobilize. The Austrian offensive was, however, brought to an early halt by the Serbs and their Montenegrin ally. After an autumn of attack and counterattack, the Serbs eventually drove the Austrians back across the Danube before the year was out. The Russians, even though they had suffered 250,000 casualties by mid-September 1914, were undeterred. Their unwieldy mobilization machine was only just getting into gear as their troop trains rolled westwards from the other side of the Urals, with the troops from Siberia taking a month to deploy. The Russian commander, the Grand Duke Nicholas, uncle of the Tsar, and seen here with him, encouraged by the French, now decided to strike at Silesia. The Germans, however, were well aware of this threat and did not feel confident that the Austrians would be able to forestall it on their own. With the race to the sea developing on the Western Front, no reinforcements were available to bolster their existing strength. Thus the victors of Tannenberg, von Hindenburg and von Ludendorff, were forced to denude their strength in East Prussia by 2/3 and rush these forces round by rail to come up, as the German Ninth Army, alongside the Austrians. Believing that attack was the best form of defense, the Germans now advanced through the virtually trackless southernmost region of Poland towards Warsaw, the main Russian supply base. By the last week in September, the Grand Duke Nicholas was aware of the German intentions and deployed his armies on the Vistula, and to strike the Germans in the flank, north of Warsaw. Crossing the Vistula on the 9th of October, the Germans closed on Warsaw. There was bitter fighting, but with the Russians moving in from the flank, the Germans decided to withdraw. The Russians had also advanced into East Prussia once more, but in spite of the weakness of the German defences, did not press home their advance with the enthusiasm they had shown in August, and soon came to a halt. In the meantime, the Austrians to the south had also attacked. Within 5 days, they had succeeded in relieving the fortress of Przemysl, but the defences on the River San proved too strong for a further advance eastwards. Then, as the Germans withdrew from in front of Warsaw, the Russians attacked the Austrians, driving them back once more and again isolating Przemysl. Flushed with their success, the Russians now resumed preparation for their thrust into Silesia. But, as before Tannenberg, poor radio security told the Germans the Russian plan. Von Mackensen's hard-marching Ninth Army was therefore hurriedly moved northwards, and in November struck the Russians, who were beginning their advance, from the northwest. The Battle of Lodz, which followed, was one of desperate fighting by both sides, as each strove to trap the other. Eventually, it was the Russians who withdrew back towards Warsaw, their invasion attempt foiled. The Germans and Austrians suffered some 130,000 casualties, while the Russians had 150,000 men captured. As 1914 drew to a close, both sides paused for breath. While it was clear that the Germans were superior to the Russians, who were now beginning to suffer a serious shortage of artillery and ammunition, the latter had certainly bested the Austrians. It was clear to the Germans, therefore, that any future Austrian offensive would need their help if it was to be successful. Von Falkenhayn, the German Chief of Staff, decided, in view of the failure to break through at Ypres on the Western Front in November 1914, to transfer troops to the east in order to seek a decision there. The Austro-German plan for early 1915 called for an offensive to drive the Russians out of East Prussia, and in the south, another to drive them away from the Carpathians and lift the siege of Przemysl. The Carpathian offensive opened in mid-January. It made little progress in the deep snow and was stopped after less than 2 weeks. The result was that the Austrian garrison of besieged Przemysl was eventually forced to surrender in March. This released additional Russian forces, which were used to recover the little ground lost in the mountains. The strike into East Prussia went better, with the Russian 10th Army, some of its soldiers even lacking rifles, being trapped for a time, and some 90,000 men being made prisoner. But the Russians displayed remarkable resilience, summoning up another army, which counterattacked, bringing the offensive to a halt. This showed the Russian soldier at his best. His innate toughness and stoicism in the face of adversity were qualities which could sustain the army through the awesome losses that it was suffering. The Central Powers were now in a dilemma as to what to do next. Von Hindenburg wanted to strike once more from East Prussia, but the Austrian Chief of Staff, Konrad von Hertzendorf, argued that it was the southern flank of the Polish salient where the potential for decisive action remained. Von Falkenhayn, seen here on the extreme left, was the arbiter, and he came down in favor of the Austrian proposal, with von Hindenburg's plan being relegated to a mere subsidiary operation. He was fully supported by the Kaiser in this. While this exercise in bloody frustration had been played out, two other theatres of war had opened. After much German persuasion, Turkey, under her elderly Sultan, joined in the war, opening her hand with a naval foray in the Black Sea at the end of October 1914. The Turks also conceived a plan to thrust into the Caucasus and foment a rising in Georgia. Winter, though, was not the best time to campaign in this region. 95,000 Turks advanced into Russian Armenia. The Russians brought in reinforcements and counterattacked, driving the Turks back with the loss of 75% of their troops, many victims of the extreme cold. For the remainder of 1915, this front remained quiet. The Caucasus triggered another campaign. In early January, the Russians asked the Western Allies to do something to remove the Turkish threat to this region. The result was the Anglo-French expedition to the Dardanelles. The plan was to seize this hilly entrance to the Black Sea and threaten Constantinople. Initially, during February and March 1915, just warships were used to force a way through the Narrows and into the Black Sea, but they were eventually foiled by mines. On the 25th of April, landings were carried out by British, Australian and French troops. Losses were high, but they managed to secure a number of toeholds. Thereafter, in the face of determined Turkish resistance, the campaign degenerated into another bitter stalemate. The The sacrifice made especially by the Australian and New Zealand troops on Gallipoli was later to be seen as the coming of age of their two countries. The heat and insanitary conditions caused much disease. Even though more and more troops were sent out, the stalemate could not be broken. Eventually, the Allies decided to cut their losses and withdrew their forces in early January 1916, after having suffered over 250,000 casualties. For the Turks, this served to more than compensate for their setbacks in the Caucasus and gave them renewed will to fight on. May 1915 saw another nation enter the war, Italy. Bent on annexing the largely Italian-speaking South Tyrol, she declared war on Austria. Now began a long, grueling struggle in the mountains of northeast Italy, terrain only too favorable for the defense. This type of fighting demonstrated the importance of howitzers, with their very high angles of fire, so very necessary to engage mountain positions. Ski troops were used extensively by both sides. Here are Austrians on patrol. To transport men and supplies, light railways were used, and even cable cars. Often, specially designed mountain guns were carried up in pieces to the highest peaks in order to engage the enemy there. Troops had to adapt to operating at high altitudes, where breathing was often difficult and energy was quickly sapped. Nevertheless, the fighting was often intense. Yet for the next 2.5 years, neither side was able to make any significant progress, although not for want of trying. For the Germans, it meant that they would have to send further troops to help their Austrian ally. May 1915 also saw the opening of the Austro-German spring offensive against the Russians. 14 divisions attacked south of the river Vistula, between Gorlice and Tarnow, and immediately sent the Russians reeling back across the River San. Przemysl was regained and Lemberg fell. The former had been so fought over during the past year that little remained of it but ruins. It looked as though the Russians might finally crack, especially when in July von Hindenburg joined in from East Prussia. As the Russians withdrew eastwards, they destroyed all the bridges over the main rivers. This proved a real challenge for the German engineers. It was imperative that the bridges were repaired or replaced quickly if the advance was to be maintained. The engineers therefore worked round the clock. With the bridges completed, the advance was therefore able to continue. Again, Russian losses were heavy. Finally, on the 5th of August, the Germans entered Warsaw, and it became the seat of government for the German occupation of Poland. Yet in spite of their losses and the continuing German advance, the Russians remained resilient. Even so, it was clear that the High Command was bankrupt in ideas. The Tsar, therefore, took personal command. He ordered a new and shorter defense line to be taken up. This was achieved by October and stretched from Riga on the Baltic to the Romanian border and successfully withstood further Austro-German penetration. After the disastrous Austrian invasion of Serbia in 1914, the Balkans remained quiet for most of 1915. But in October, Bulgaria joined the Central Powers and, in conjunction with Austrian and German forces, struck at Serbia. This opportunist decision by the Bulgarian king, Ferdinand, seen here, was the straw that broke the back of Serbia. Faced with overwhelming superiority in numbers, the Serbs were forced into a retreat, and their country was overrun. The Austrians then turned on Montenegro and Albania, occupying both early in 1916. Thus, the beginning of 1916 found the Central Powers very much in the ascendant in the east. The Dardanelles were firmly back under Turkish control, and the Turks had held the Russians in the east. The Balkans too had been largely overrun, even though an Anglo-French force had been sent to Salonika in a vain attempt to help the Serbs. While this eventually brought Greece into the war, it was a significant diversion from the Western Front and was unable to do more than prevent the Bulgarians from advancing south. Not for nothing did the Germans later call Salonika their biggest concentration camp of the war. The Italians had butted their heads in vain against the Austrian defenses. The Russians had lost much territory and suffered over 2 million casualties during 1915. Even so, they continued to fight on. To restore Allied fortunes in 1916, attacks were called for by the French and British in the west, the Italians and the Russians. Simultaneously, the Germans, satisfied with their successes in the east in 1915, decided to concentrate their attention on the west. January 1916, however, saw a Russian offensive into Turkish Armenia. The Russians made much use of the hardy two-humped Bactrian camel, a native of the Asian steppes, and also employed by the Mongols during their forays into Europe 700 years earlier. The thrust was brilliantly successful. Not only was the key fortress of Erzurum captured, but also the port of Trebizond, with the assistance of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The Turks suffered further when they tried a counteroffensive, with only those formations which had fought in the Dardanelles performing with any credit. By the autumn, they had had enough and went back onto the defensive. A new Russian general, Alexei Brusilov, was put in charge of the main 1916 offensive. He recognized that one major advantage that the Central Powers enjoyed was a comprehensive rail network which enabled them to deploy reserves quickly to any threatened point. Brusilov therefore decided to attack on a wide front to keep these reserves tied down. He chose, too, to strike at the Austrians rather than the Germans. Careful preparation included saps being dug to within 75 yards of the Austrian lines and the construction of huge dugouts to protect the reserves from artillery fire. By the end of May, all Russian preparations were complete. The only question was whether the long-suffering Russian army, and indeed the Russian people, had the will to sustain another offensive. Brusilov opened the great Russian offensive of 1916 on the 4th of June. This was almost a month before the Anglo-French effort in the West. In spite of mounting fierce counterattacks, the Austrians soon had a great hole torn in their defenses, and the Russians advanced steadily towards the Carpathians in the south and the River Bug in the north. One of the main Austrian problems was that they had begun to run out of artillery shells. Thus, for once, the Russian guns enjoyed superiority over their opponents. Soon the Austrian withdrawal degenerated almost into panic. Many were made prisoner, and it seemed as though the Austrian armies were on the verge of collapse. The Germans, who were now heavily committed at both Verdun and on the Somme on the Western Front, had to scrabble desperately to gather reserves to stop the rot. Encouraged by Brusilov's success, Romania declared war on the Central Powers at the end of August, a fatal decision. While the Romanians were mobilized, the Russian offensive had slowed through lack of reserves and supplies. The Germans struck the northern flank of the Russian salient, and although they were held, Brusilov decided his position was now too vulnerable and withdrew to his original line. At the beginning of September, German, Austro-Hungarian and Bulgarian forces now turned on isolated Romania. She had an army of some 500,000 men. It was not badly equipped, but suffered from the poor quality of its officer corps, although the men were willing enough. It was therefore not well prepared to face the onslaught which now fell on it. The Central Powers, with their more efficient communications and their battle-hardened troops, proved to be too strong. By the end of the year, they had overrun most of Romania, whose army was now left holding just the northernmost province of Moldavia. Only buttressing by Russia kept the Romanians in the war. Brusilov's offensive had shown how well the Russians could fight when properly organized. Once more, the Russian soldier had demonstrated his bravery and powers of endurance. The rebuff that the Russians had suffered, however, when they were forced to withdraw, did have its effect on morale. It was hard for the soldiers to accept the loss of ground which they had captured at the cost of the deaths of so many of their comrades. Hundreds of thousands now lay buried in East Prussia, Galicia and the Carpathians. Many others languished in Austrian and German prisoner-of-war camps, where, cut off from news of home, they could only wait helplessly for the war to end. Their only comfort was that at least they were alive. Vast numbers had been wounded. This put an almost unbearable strain on the medical system, and it was beginning to collapse. The Russian army was in danger of falling to pieces. Only careful nurturing could maintain it as a fighting force. But behind the front, in Russia itself, the very fabric of society was beginning to come apart. The economy had collapsed. Industry, apart from that directly supporting the war, had come to a standstill. The transport system had also collapsed. With no end to the fighting seemingly in sight, the Russian people were beginning to despair. This was made worse by the paralyzing effects of the Russian winter, which made life that much harder to bear. Agriculture was suffering from both loss of manpower and draft animals to the war effort, and food reserves were beginning to dry up. Famine was stalking the streets. The result of all this was a growing number of strikes and increasing questioning over the conduct of the war. The Bolsheviks and other revolutionaries fanned the flames of this discontent through underground newspapers and leaflets. The Russian Navy especially provided fertile ground, since many months of relative inactivity in port had bred boredom and discontent. Indeed, in autumn 1916, there were mutinies in both the Baltic and Black Sea fleets. The Tsar and his immediate entourage became increasingly isolated. His own indecisiveness and weak will did not help. Even those who had been close to him had become ever more exasperated by the way in which his wife, the Tsarina, whose will was stronger than her husband's when it came to affairs of state, was influenced by her sinister guru, Rasputin. Worse, the Tsar and his clique answered the threat of revolution with even greater repression, and some of his closest followers even began to secretly negotiate with the Germans, in the belief that ending the war would remove this threat to the throne. The privileged group which had always surrounded him became desperate, and some went so far as to murder Rasputin on the 30th of December 1916. The Tsar, however, failed to take the hint, and continued to ignore all calls for reform and for a new government more sympathetic to the people's plight. There was a rapid rise in the numbers of striking workers. Tension grew. In early March, the Russian parliament, the Duma, met amid increasingly vociferous demonstrations. The Tsar, who had gone to his headquarters at the front, ordered the unrest to be quelled by force and for the Duma to be dissolved. Neither measure was successful, and significantly, members of the military garrison of Petrograd, as St. Petersburg had been called since 1914, had joined the demonstrators. The Duma formed a provisional committee to try and restore order. At the same time, a new body came into being, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, dedicated to forming a parliament based on universal, equal, secret, and direct suffrage. The Tsar attempted to return to Petrograd by train, but was diverted by revolutionaries. Now totally isolated, the Tsar accepted that he had only one option: to abdicate. This he did on the 15th of March 1917. He handed his throne to his brother, the Grand Duke Michael, who declined to accept it. 5 days later, Nicholas and his family were arrested. The Russian monarchy was now at an end. A provisional government was now formed representing all shades of political opinion, but the Petrograd Soviet remained a separate body, which would cause increasing difficulties. The government was loath to use force to put down the continuing unrest, preferring to use persuasion. The regime assured the Western Allies that Russia would continue to play her part in the war. The Petrograd Soviet, however, called on all the warring nations to renounce all aggressive aims and make an early peace. Russia too could not continue the war without the active support of the army, which was being infiltrated by agitators. The Germans, too, keen to exploit the situation, played their part. The main Bolshevik leader, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin, had been in exile since 1905 in Switzerland with a small group of followers. In April 1917, the Germans arranged for him to secretly be taken by train to Russia, traveling via Sweden and Finland. Lenin's cry was "all power to the Soviets," meaning that they should take power in place of the provisional government. A new force had by now risen to dominate the latter: Alexander Kerensky, who became Minister of War. He set about ensuring the army's support, appointing commissars to the various headquarters to act as the link between the soldiers' committees which had been set up and the commanders. He also brought in Brusilov, who had led the summer 1916 offensive, as commander-in-chief. The two of them planned another major offensive, using the less disaffected formations. The idea was to strike into Galicia once more, with attacks north and south of the river Dniester. By gathering together every existing weapon, there were more guns and shells available for it than in any previous Russian offensive. Other preparations were thin in the extreme. The Austrians and Germans were well aware that it was going to take place. Indeed, it was common talk in Petrograd. The offensive began on the 1st of July, after a 2-day bombardment. This was largely ineffective against well-prepared defenses. In sectors held by the Germans, the first line was thinly held, and so there was initial success. But when the Russians came up against the second line, they suffered. South of the Dniester, the Austro-Hungarian defense was less effective, and the Russians succeeded in driving a wedge between two armies. But by mid-July, they had been halted everywhere. 3 days later, they faced a counter-offensive. As the Germans attacked, the fragile structure that Kerensky had managed to salvage had collapsed. His troops fled in panic, many deserting. Only when they reached the old border with Austro-Hungary did they recover. Special death battalions rounded up deserters and shot or hanged them. This and other draconian measures enabled the armies to prevent any further Austro-German advance. This disaster served to increase civil unrest. In Petrograd, Lenin attempted a coup in July. Kerensky was able to snuff it out with the help of some loyal troops hastily brought back from the front. Lenin was forced to go into hiding in Finland, while Kerensky now headed the provisional government. Even so, anarchy was beginning to engulf the country. Faced with this rapidly deteriorating situation, Kerensky turned to General Kornilov, whom he had appointed as commander-in-chief in place of Brusilov. Kornilov would only support Kerensky if he was prepared to institute tough measures to cope with civil and military unrest. This, of course, would run counter to the democracy that the provisional government was pledged to further. While the cabinet deliberated, Kerensky was misinformed that Kornilov wanted the dissolution of the government and that all power should go to him. Kornilov was therefore arrested. This happened in September and meant that Kerensky now had lost the general support of the officer corps. In the meantime, in what was to be their final attack, the Germans captured Riga, Russia's second largest Baltic port. They used the stormtroop tactics that the Western Allies were to face in spring 1918. Once Riga had been secured, the Germans halted to await developments, even though such was the state of the Russian army that many soldiers were now refusing to fight and merely withdrawing. Lenin and his Bolsheviks were waiting in the wings and recognized that the growing isolation of the provisional government was creating a power vacuum, but it would be a few weeks before they were ready. Leon Trotsky was given the crucial task of winning over, or at least neutralizing, the 350,000 men that made up the Petrograd military district. He was largely successful in this, playing on their unwillingness to be sent to the front. The revolutionaries' own armed strength was largely reliant on 60,000 embittered sailors of the Baltic fleet. On the 30th of October, Lenin returned clandestinely from Finland. A revolutionary military committee was set up and sent commissars to each regiment and ship. Not until the very eve of the revolution did the provisional government wake up to what was happening as the Bolshevik forces massed. The cruiser Aurora, which was moored in the river Neva, which runs through Petrograd, was ordered back to her base at Kronstadt to prevent her guns being used by the revolutionaries. Both sides now raced to secure the bridges connecting the islands on which Petrograd was built. By the end of the 6th of November, it was the revolutionaries who had control of most of them. They also occupied the telegraph office and key railway stations. All was now set for the uprising to begin the following day. Early on the 7th, Kerensky began frantic telephoning to get more troops from outlying garrisons, especially Cossacks who were known to be anti-Bolshevik. Their morale was as low as most other units, however, and their response was slow. In the meantime, the revolutionaries seized further key points in the city. By mid-morning, Kerensky was desperate and decided to go by car to the headquarters of the northern armies to obtain loyal troops to crush the revolution. He left, leaving the provisional government in session in the Winter Palace, and never returned. It was the Winter Palace which now became the center of attention. It was defended by a motley collection of Cossacks and cadets. There was also a battalion of women soldiers. The government resisted surrender demands. That evening, the cruiser Aurora, which had not sailed, began to bombard the palace. Many of its defenders deserted. By 11 p.m., only a handful remained, and the revolutionaries broke down the gates and charged into the palace, as immortalized in these scenes from Eisenstein's 1928 film, 10 Days That Shook the World. Searching room by room, they eventually came across the ministers of the provisional government and arrested them. The revolution had been victorious, and soon all symbols of the previous regime were being torn down. A few days later, Moscow also succumbed, but in most cities elsewhere, the revolutionaries failed. It was going to take much fighting to bring the country under control. Meanwhile, Russia was still at war with the Central Powers. Overtures were made to Germany, and an armistice came into force on the Eastern Front in mid-December. This enabled the Germans to begin transferring troops to the Western Front in order to strike at the Western Allies before the American presence in France became too strong. Indeed, one of Russia's allies was already feeling the effects of the additional manpower that was now becoming available from the cessation of operations on the Eastern Front. On the 24th of October 1917, Austrian and German divisions struck at the Italian armies in the mountains of northeast Italy. The Italians had been under increasing strain from the heavy casualties they had suffered during their largely fruitless attacks of the past 2 years. They were now mentally ill-equipped to meet this devastating blow. Their few attempts to counterattack failed. Soon the Austrians and Germans were through the main defences. They broke out of the mountains and into the plains beyond, capturing a huge number of Italians as they retreated in growing panic. Not until they reached the river Piave, just 15 miles from Venice, were the Italians able to stabilize the situation. In response to frantic Italian pleas, the British and French were forced to send 11 divisions from France in order to bolster their resistance. In Russia, the crippling losses suffered during 1914 to 1917 made peace imperative. The Bolsheviks hoped to avoid any loss of territory, but they had to hand over Poland and the Baltic states and give part of the Caucasus to Turkey before the peace could be signed at Brest-Litovsk on the 3rd of March 1918. Worse, encouraged by the local people, Austrian and German troops advanced into the Ukraine. Known as Russia's breadbasket, this region pressed for independence from Petrograd, and indeed signed a separate peace treaty with the Central Powers, who soon occupied the whole of it. Romania was also forced to surrender. As the Russian forces withdrew, They were only too aware of the humiliation of the peace. There was, however, to be no rest for the soldiers. Their Bolshevik masters were soon dispatching them to all corners of Russia in order to wage what had already become a bloody civil war. The Western Allies had made considerable effort to bolster Kerensky's government. The British and French now began to send supplies via the northern ports of Archangel and Murmansk in order to support anti-Bolshevik elements. By spring 1918, they had also begun to send warships here. Japanese, American and British warships were also sent to the far eastern port of Vladivostok, and troops were landed. This was the beginning of the Allied intervention, which would add another dimension to the Russian Civil War.